There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from being a Prussian officer trained in the classical German military tradition. It is not arrogance exactly. It is more like the quiet certainty of a chess grandmaster who has already calculated every possible move on the board and knows with complete mathematical assurance that the game belongs to him. That was the mindset of Colonel General Heinrich von Vietinghoff on the morning of September 13, 1943. Vietinghoff was a product of decades of German military education, a man schooled in the ideas of Clausewitz, Moltke, in the sharp operational thinking that had made the Wehrmacht a terror across Europe. He believed in the tangible mechanics of war, elevation, armor concentration, supply lines, division density against a fixed enemy position, and on that September morning, standing over his maps at his headquarters near Sant'Angelo, north of Naples, every single one of those variables pointed in one direction. He was going to drive the Allied invaders straight back into the sea. Below him, trapped on a narrow coastal strip along the Gulf of Salerno, was the United States Fifth Army under General Mark Clark, a force that by this point was barely holding itself together. The Allies had been ashore for 4 days. The beachhead they occupied was shallow, cramped, and under constant German artillery fire from the commanding ridges and limestone peaks above. Vietinghoff had 6 full divisions either already in position or converging on the scene. He had the high ground. He had veteran panzer crews who had fought at Stalingrad and El Alamein. He had artillery observers tucked into every hilltop, watching every American move in real time. By every doctrine Vietinghoff had studied for 30 years, the math was simple. The numbers were overwhelming. The opportunity was historic. He was wrong. And the reason he was wrong was sitting 12 miles offshore, invisible, rocking gently in the Mediterranean swell, a fact that would rewrite everything the Germans thought they understood about how modern war was fought. To understand what happened on September 13th, you have to understand just how badly the Allied landing at Salerno had gone from the very beginning. Operation Avalanche, the code name for the September 9th landings, had been planned under enormous time pressure and with a set of decisions that, in hindsight, look almost reckless. The most significant was this. In order to preserve the element of surprise, General Clark made the call to land without any pre-invasion naval or aerial bombardment. The U.S. Naval Commander, Vice Admiral H. Kent Hewitt, argued strenuously against this. He reasoned, correctly, that Salerno was the only viable landing site within range of Allied fighter cover from Sicily. Every competent German strategist would have predicted it. Surprise, Hewitt insisted, was an illusion. He was right. The Germans had been warned. When the first American landing craft from the 36th Infantry Division grounded on the beach at Panstam at 3:30 in the morning of September 9th, a German loudspeaker crackled to life from somewhere in the darkness. In English, it said, "Come on in and give up. We have you covered." The troops went in anyway. That takes a particular kind of courage. What followed was a landing that rapidly descended into a controlled disaster. The geography of the invasion zone contained a fundamental flaw that would haunt the operation for days. The Saliri River, flowing down from the mountains into the Gulf, physically divided the two Allied landing forces. The British 10th Corps was north of the river, the American 6th Corps was south, and between them sat a gap that eventually stretched to somewhere between 7 and 10 miles. No Allied troops held that gap. It was an empty corridor pointing like an arrow into the heart of the invasion force, and it might as well have had a neon sign over it reading, "Attack here." The 16th Panzer Division, under the command of Major General Rudolf C. Kennius, had arrived in the Salerno area only weeks before and had used the time well. C. Kennius had organized his forces into 4 mixed battle groups spread across the beaches, and when the Allies came ashore without any preparatory fire, those battle groups were ready. By 7 in the morning on the 9th, the 16th Panzer had launched its first major counterattack. It caused serious casualties. It was eventually beaten back, partly through the fighting of the American infantry and partly through naval gunfire support, but it set the tone for everything that followed. The beach in those first days was not the organized military installation it was supposed to be. It was something closer to organized chaos with incoming artillery fire added on top.
Crates of ammunition were stacked next to medical supplies, next to fuel cans, next to ration boxes, all dumped onto the sand because there was simply no room to sort them. Bulldozers tried to carve rough tracks through the mess, but every time a lane opened, another wave of landing craft deposited more men and material into it. Ammunition ran short. Units landed in the wrong sectors. The 45th Infantry Division, which was supposed to act as a floating reserve, had to be committed almost immediately. By the 12th of September, things had gotten measurably worse. German reinforcements had been arriving steadily. The 26th Panzer Division and elements of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, freed from engagement with Montgomery's 8th Army in the south, were now rushing north to join the battle.
The Germans had retaken Altavilla and Hill 424, reopening the Celle corridor. Vietinghoff studied his situation map, saw the gap between the British and Americans still sitting there like an open wound, and made his decision. He called for a ruthless concentration of all available forces at Salerno. He would drive through the gap, split the Allied armies in two, and massacre them individually on the beaches. The German counterattack began in earnest on the afternoon of September 13th, and for a time it looked exactly as Vietinghoff had planned. 3 divisions, the 16th Panzer, the 29th Panzer Grenadier, and elements of the 26th Panzer, launched a coordinated assault aimed at the Celle-Calore corridor, the soft seam between the American and British sectors. The Panzer Grenadiers moved through the Italian countryside in the late afternoon, some of them reportedly marching and singing Lily Marlene, while flares and fireworks were fired into the sky to make the assault look like a larger force than it was. Psychological warfare layered on top of the firepower. The results were immediate and brutal. German armor hit the positions of the 2nd Battalion 143rd Infantry Regiment hard on both flanks and broke through, inflicting roughly 500 casualties and taking hundreds of prisoners in a single engagement. The American 36th Infantry Division, already stretched thin across roughly 35 miles of front, began to crumble in places. Units that had been holding positions for days suddenly found German tanks in their rear areas. Communication lines went down. Runners couldn't keep pace with how fast the situation was changing. By late afternoon, German armored spearheads had punched through the American lines and were driving toward the coast. They were within 2 miles of the beach. The tank commanders could see the surf and the piled supplies and the desperate, organized confusion of the American rear area. In front of them, the only thing standing between a full German breakthrough and the sea was 2 batteries of 105mm American howitzers and a thin screen of infantry, and those guns were already firing at point-blank range at advancing German armor. In General Clark's headquarters, which was itself only a few hundred yards behind the artillery line, his staff was already preparing contingency plans. Clark considered evacuating the American sector entirely and shifting his forces to the British beachhead. His naval commanders told him this was essentially impractical, given the mines, the beaches, and the sheer logistical impossibility of moving thousands of men under fire in the dark. There was no good option. The situation had moved from critical to potentially catastrophic in the space of a single afternoon. The Luftwaffe was flying 450 sorties a day from bases in Foggia. German artillery observers on the ridges were watching every Allied movement and directing fire with the confidence of men who knew exactly where their targets were. The radio intercepts coming into German headquarters were full of American officers begging for ammunition and reinforcements that weren't arriving fast enough. Vietinghoff sensed the breaking point. He pressed harder. And then something strange happened. The German forward units stopped reporting. Not because they had found heavy resistance. Not because they had hit a minefield or encountered unexpected American armor. The reports that did come back were confused, almost incoherent. Veteran tank commanders, men who had fought in Russia and North Africa, men who had seen almost everything war could produce, were screaming into their radios about shells falling vertically from a clear sky, about explosions so large they were flipping 30-ton tanks onto their sides, about concussion waves killing infantry out in the open at distances of hundreds of meters, about craters appearing in the earth large enough to swallow vehicles whole. The German advance through the Celle corridor didn't slow. It stopped, and then it went into reverse. Vietinghoff demanded answers. Where was this fire coming from? His artillery observers couldn't see any American heavy guns in the forward positions. The Luftwaffe reported no heavy bombers overhead. Whatever was hitting his men was invisible, and it was hitting with a precision and a tempo that nothing in the German military's experience had prepared it for. 12 miles offshore, the answer was rocking gently on the Mediterranean swell.
The USS Philadelphia was a Brooklyn-class light cruiser, 9,000 tons of American steel carrying 15 6-inch guns arranged in 5 triple turrets. She had been in combat since the invasion of North Africa in November 1942, had supported the landings at Sicily in July 1943, and was now sitting in the Gulf of Salerno as part of the Naval Fire Support Force. She was not, by the standards of the larger warships of the era, a particularly famous ship. But at Salerno, she became a weapon system of almost terrifying efficiency. What made her effective was not just the guns themselves, it was the system behind the guns. Hidden somewhere in the rubble of the Italian coast, a bombed farmhouse, a hillside position, a ditch with a view, was a small team of American naval personnel known as a Shore Fire Control Party. Their job was not to shoot anything. Their job was to watch the German advance through binoculars, read off grid coordinates into a radio handset, and relay that information to the Philadelphia. To the Germans moving through the Salé corridor, these men were invisible. They looked like nothing, specks in a landscape of chaos if they were seen at all. In reality, they were the targeting system for a weapon that could reach 12 miles with lethal accuracy. When the coordinates arrived on the Philadelphia, they were fed into the ship's fire control center, specifically into the Ford Mark I fire control computer, which was one of the most sophisticated pieces of technology in American military service at that time. This was not a digital computer in any modern sense. It was an electromechanical analog device, built from brass gears, cams, and integrators, weighing roughly 3,000 pounds, and installed deep in the ship's hull where it was protected from battle damage. It was designed by the Ford Instrument Company, no relation to the car manufacturer, specifically for naval fire control. What this machine could do was remarkable for its era. It did not simply aim the guns at a fixed point, it calculated. It took into account the ship's own speed and heading, the wind speed and direction, the air density, the rotation of the Earth and its Coriolis effect, the temperature of the powder charges, and the trajectory ballistics of a 6-inch shell fired over 12 miles of open water.
It solved all of these variables simultaneously, in real time, using a system of rotating disks and mechanical integrators that were accurate to a degree that astonished everyone who understood what they were seeing. Crucially, the computer was linked to a gyroscopic stabilization system that sensed the ship's roll and pitch in the Mediterranean swell. As the Philadelphia moved through the water, rocking, turning, accelerating, the computer automatically adjusted the elevation and bearing of every gun mount to compensate hundreds of times per second. The ship could fire while underway at 20 knots, while rolling in a sea swell, while turning onto a new course, and the shells would still land within a circle roughly 50 meters wide at a distance of 12 miles. For the Shore Fire Control Party on the beach, the process was startlingly simple. They called a grid coordinate. They waited. Within roughly 30 seconds, the first salvo landed. If it was slightly off target, they spoke a correction into the handset. Left 200, add 100, and the next salvo walked directly onto the target. There was no waiting for an artillery battery commander to consult tables and shout orders. There was no 3 to 10-minute delay for calculation and adjustment that conventional artillery required against moving targets. The German panzers were not fighting human reaction times. They were fighting the processing speed of a machine. One naval officer's account from a ship off Salerno, published years later in Naval History magazine, captures what this looked like from the fire control side. They had been firing for 3 or 4 hours when a spotter reported German tanks moving through a river plain. When the salvos began to fall at 4-second intervals, he wrote, "The panzers all turned at once as if following a signal and tried to accelerate away from the gunfire, but not all of them made it." During the peak of the German counterattack, the Philadelphia fired 921 rounds of 6-inch ammunition. The record shows that in one documented fire mission, her guns found a concentration of 35 German tanks near the beachhead area, destroyed 7 of them outright, and sent the remainder scattering back into cover.
An attack that had been building for days, aimed at driving the Allied invasion force into the sea, had been broken before it could fully develop.
The effect on German morale was profound and documented. General Hermann Balck, commanding the 14th Panzer Corps, the primary German armored formation at Salerno, later wrote that his tanks suffered heavily under Allied naval gunfire and that they had nothing to counter it with. This was not a general offering excuses after a defeat. This was a battlefield observation about a fundamental problem. The German military, despite all its tactical brilliance, had no answer for artillery that could reach this far, fire this accurately, and correct onto moving targets this quickly. The Philadelphia was not alone. As the German counterattack reached its most critical phase, the Royal Navy added a weight of fire that changed the physics of the battlefield entirely. HMS Warspite and HMS Valiant were Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, both veterans of 2 world wars and dozens of engagements across the length and breadth of the global conflict. Warspite, whose crew called her the Grand Old Lady, had been earning battle honors since the Battle of Jutland in 1916. At Salerno, she would earn 1 more. The 2 battleships had been en route back to Britain to begin preparations for what would eventually become the Normandy invasion when word reached Force H that the Salerno beachhead was in danger of collapse. Warspite and Valiant were detached from the fleet and turned south. On September 15th, they arrived on station and opened fire. The 15-inch gun is a different category of weapon from anything in the land arsenal of 1943. Each shell weighed approximately 1,900 pounds, roughly the weight of a small automobile. The explosive filler alone was more than 6 times the payload of a standard German artillery round. When these shells hit the limestone terrain around Salerno, they did not simply create craters. They created what survivors described as artificial earthquakes. The supersonic speed of the projectile meant there was no warning sound, no incoming whistle, none of the auditory cues that infantry had learned to read and react to. One moment the ground was there. The next moment a section of it simply was not. Warspite arrived off Salerno and spent time carefully coordinating her fire with shore spotters before opening up on German positions around Altavia Silentina and the surrounding hills. The psychological effect on German troops who had fought across Europe and Russia was documented and striking. These were men who understood artillery, who had learned to read the battlefield, who had developed the reflexes and the mental toughness to function under sustained fire. But the scale and precision of naval bombardment at this level was something categorically different from anything in their experience. The ground itself was being systematically rearranged around them. German units that had been advancing began to pull back into cover. Units in cover found that cover being destroyed around them. Vietinghoff himself later reported to his superiors that his attacks had been unable to reach their objectives owing to fire from naval guns and low-flying aircraft. The German 10th Army commander, a man trained to find tactical solutions, was acknowledging in writing that he had encountered something he could not solve with the tools available to him. The combined fire of the Philadelphia, supporting cruisers and destroyers, and now the 2 Royal Navy battleships, created an effective exclusion zone that extended roughly 12 miles inland. Inside that zone, concentrations of German armor could not survive long enough to achieve their objectives. Movement in the open became a death sentence. The attack corridors that Vietinghoff had identified, the flat river valleys, the coastal plains, the approaches to the beach, were precisely the areas where the naval guns were most effective, because ship spotters could see every movement in that open ground. Adding to the German difficulties were the 1,300 paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division who began dropping into the beachhead on the night of September 13th. General Clark, in one of the better decisions of a difficult campaign, had requested an emergency insertion of the division's parachute regiments to reinforce the thinning American line. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment went in first that evening, followed by the 505th on the night of the 14th-15th, another 2,100 men. Their arrival stiffened the American infantry positions at exactly the critical moment, and when German units struck those positions on September 14th, they found not the exhausted, thinning line they had been probing, but fresh troops who had been told they were here to hold the line and nothing else. The German attack on the 14th failed to make meaningful progress. By September 15th, both the 16th Panzer and the 29th Panzer Grenadier Divisions had gone on the defensive. The great counterattack, the assault that had come within 2 miles of pushing the Allied invasion into the sea,
was over. On September 16th, Vietinghoff advised Field Marshal Kesselring that further offensive operations were not feasible and requested permission to withdraw to prepare defensive positions to the north. Kesselring agreed and gave the orders on the 17th. German forces began pulling back toward what would eventually become the Winter Line and then the Gustav Line, the brutal defensive positions that would occupy Allied attention for the better part of the next 2 years. When the fighting died down at Salerno, the statistics told part of the story. The Allied naval forces at Salerno fired a total of 71,500 artillery projectiles over the course of the campaign, more than 2 shells for every German soldier engaged in the battle. The USS Philadelphia alone fired 921 rounds during the peak of the German counterattack, wearing the rifling out of her gun barrels so severely that they showed significant erosion by the end of the engagement. The 36th Infantry Division's artillery fired over 4,100 rounds on a single day. The 45th Division's guns fired 6,687 rounds on September 14th, the highest single-day total of the entire Salerno campaign. But numbers only capture part of what happened at Salerno in September 1943. What mattered more than the tonnage of steel fired was the lesson that the battle demonstrated, in terms too clear to be misread by anyone paying attention. The German military in 1943 was arguably the finest conventional land army in the world. Its doctrine, its tactics, its battlefield leadership at every level, its equipment, and the quality of its soldiers, by any traditional measure, the Wehrmacht had few peers. Vietinghoff's plan at Salerno was tactically sound. The gap in the Allied lines was a genuine vulnerability. The timing of the counterattack was well chosen. The execution in the early hours was genuinely impressive and came closer to success than Allied accounts sometimes acknowledge. But Vietinghoff's battle was being fought in a framework that no longer applied. The Allied military system at Salerno was not an army and a navy operating in support of each other. It was a single integrated weapons system, a chain that stretched from a naval observer crouching in the Italian rubble through a radio link and a fire control computer 12 miles offshore through the gun crews below decks to the impact of a 6-inch shell on a German panzer formation within 30 seconds of the target being identified. The German military had been trained to fight armies. It had developed tactics for countering artillery. It had no answer for the combination of reach, accuracy, speed of response, and sheer sustained volume of fire that the Allied naval force brought to bear. What the German 10th Army encountered in the Gulf of Salerno was what happens when industrial-age production capacity is married to precision targeting technology in the system of communication that allows both to operate in near real time. The shore-fire control parties hidden in the rubble were not just calling in airstrikes. They were operating as the forward sensors of a system whose processing power and range were entirely beyond the German ability to counter or even fully comprehend. General Balk's words after the battle capture this perfectly. His tanks, he wrote, suffered heavily under Allied naval gunfire with which they had nothing to counter. Nothing. In a war where the Germans had demonstrated a consistent and remarkable ability to find tactical solutions to almost every problem placed in front of them, Salerno produced a problem they could not solve. The same lesson would be demonstrated again and again in the months and years that followed, at Anzio, at Normandy, at every Allied amphibious operation where naval fire support was integrated into the land battle. The age of the independent Panzer Division operating on the basis of tactical brilliance and superior battlefield skill was not entirely over. But at Salerno, in September 1943, it encountered its limits. Vietinghoff would continue fighting in Italy. He was a capable commander who adapted as best he could to the new realities of the campaign, and the Italian theater would remain an extraordinarily difficult slog for the Allies right up to the end of the war in Europe. But he never again had a moment when he stood over his maps and felt the quiet mathematical certainty that the battle was already won. The horizon had intervened. The invisible fire from the ships he could not see had taught him something that no amount of Prussian military training had prepared him to learn. You cannot outmaneuver an equation. You cannot outflank an industrial assembly line. And you cannot win a ground battle against weapons that can reach you from a place where you cannot touch them, corrected onto your position by observers you cannot find, solved by a machine you cannot destroy. The beach at Salerno held.
The Allied invasion of Italy survived.
And somewhere in the hills above the Gulf, looking down at the aftermath of the counterattack he had been so certain would succeed, Vietinghoff learned what kind of war this had actually become. That's the story of the invisible fire at Salerno, one of the more extraordinary and underappreciated turning points of the Italian campaign. If you found this video interesting, please hit the like button below and subscribe to War Chronicles 1940. We cover exactly these kinds of stories, the battles within the battles, the technical factors, and the human moments that changed the course of the war, often in ways that don't make the headlines but shaped everything that followed. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and tell us what stories you'd like to see covered next. We read every single one.